Good morning, everyone. That was some nice music to get us started on a nice early Friday morning. Welcome to today's Early Intervention in Psychosis, or EIP, National Network event on cannabis and psychosis. These events are part of a series of webinars that we, as the EIP programme in the Improvement Hub at Healthcare Improvement Scotland, have been putting out over the past year. My name is Ashley Hose, and I've been leading on this work. This has been active since about 2018 and is currently funded by the Scottish Government. So this morning we're really excited to be offering you the chance to hear from our world-known speakers, Professor Sir Robin Murray and Dr. Marta De Forti, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first I just want to go over some housekeeping slides for the session. So this is going to be recorded and we will be sending out a copy of the recording and any resources and slides following the session today. There's a lot of us on the call today, and we would really appreciate if you would use the Q&A function to submit your questions. But first, I just want to go. And if you could pop your questions into the chat box, we will be able to facilitate that coming forward, and you'll be able to vote for your favourite question as well. So please use that. And I think there's a slide just to show you where to access that box for anybody who's unfamiliar. So at the top right of your screen, you'll see a Q&A. It's a little speech bubble like the one you see there. And if you go into the next slide, please, then if you just type your question in at the bottom, we moderate them in the background, which means we publish them at the side. So you'll be able to see the question come into the chat box, you'll be able to see questions from other people coming in, and you'll be able to vote on them. And the idea being that we'll ask the questions after the presentations. So these are probably two presenters that we do not need to introduce, but for those of you who are not as familiar, we have Robin, who's a Professor of Psychiatric Research at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. He's also an Honorary Consultant Psychiatrist at South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. Now, Robin was one of the first to suggest that schizophrenia was in part a neurodevelopmental disorder, and he's contributed to the understanding that environmental factors such as obstetric events, drug abuse and social adversity increase the risk of psychosis. Robin's also the most frequently cited psychosis researcher outside of the USA. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2010 and received a knighthood in 2011. And if that wasn't enough, we also have Dr. Marta De Forti, who is a clinical reader in psychosis research at the Department of Social, Developmental and Genetic Research at the Institute of Psychiatry, and an Honorary Consultant Adult Psychiatrist at the Lambeth EI Community Team at South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. Marta leads the first cannabis clinic for patients with psychotic disorders in the UK, and she was recently awarded the Royal College of Psychiatrists Researcher of the Year Prize. And in 2020, she was granted an MRC Senior Research Fellowship to expand her research in the role of cannabis use in psychosis and its underlying biology. So two absolutely fantastic speakers that we've got on this morning. We will be doing questions after Robin's presentation, before Marta comes on, and again questions after Marta, and then we'll use what time we have left to ask any other questions. And facilitating the question session today, we have our clinical lead for our programme, who's Dr. Rajiv Krishnadas, who's a consultant psychiatrist, and he works in the Esteem EI service in Greater Glasgow and Clyde. So he'll be coming on in the middle to facilitate the questions. So without further ado, I would now like to pass you over to Robin to take us away with his presentation.
So very nice to be with you. Of course, it would be nicer to be actually with you in Scotland, but we didn't manage to coordinate that this time. So I'm going to talk more generally about cannabis and psychosis, and then Marta's going to talk about her experience in the first episode unit here in South London. So just to remind, just to Now we can't go forward. I'm sorry, the next hitch is that I can't change the slides.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not getting an option to give you control.
Well, I'll tell you to change.
Here we go.
Okay.
Here we go.
Right.
No, nothing. Ah, there we go. Right. So it's always more fun when things go wrong, because some of you who are sort of just joining, thinking this might be a bit boring. Well, nothing would happen. Well, two things have happened. First of all, you got two of me, and then I couldn't change the slides. So just to remind you, there's in cannabis, there's lots of different cannabinoid constituents, but the two big ones are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and it is a partial agonist at the CB1 receptor. So in our brains, in our bodies, we have an endocannabinoid system, like we have a dopamine system or a serotonin system. We have an endocannabinoid system, and part of that is the cannabinoid receptor 1, and THC hits that partially, not 100%. It's a partial activator or agonist. And of course, it causes euphoria. That's why people take it. People enjoy it. It's fun. If you take too much, you get impairment of attention, of memory, or learning. So all of you know, I'm sure, that you're trying to talk to somebody who's stoned. They may think they're unlocking the secrets of the universe, but they can't remember the beginning of their sentence when they've got to the end of it. So it's a well-known cognitive impairer while you're taking it. It's more controversial whether, when you stop, whether your cognition returns to normal or not. If you take too much, you could get paranoid ideas and hallucinations. And we have done quite a lot of, particularly with Paul Morrison, who's now a consultant psychiatrist in Argyll and Bute. Paul spent a lot of time giving young men THC and intravenously, and inducing paranoia and hallucinations in them, particularly paranoia. On the other hand, there's cannabidiol, CBD. It's not hallucinogenic. It has anxiety relieving properties, a sort of chill out effect. And there's some evidence that it antagonizes the effects of THC in very large doses. If I can move on, which is there we go. So this is what's been happening to cannabis potency in England, and I'm sorry I don't have data for Scotland. So of course we are now self-sufficient in the UK in cannabis production. It's one of the areas of productivity in the UK, one of the few areas that's increased very greatly, and you can see it's often in these indoor cannabis, they call them cannabis farms, but although they're actually in houses. So I'm still having trouble getting things to change. So here is the different types of cannabis. This is cannabis resin, and it hasn't changed in potency, at least between the 1990s and 2008. Why do these not come up?
Sorry, Robin, it seems to be struggling to let me give you control. So just let me know and I'll click through, all right?
Okay, so you click on, yep. And so then the next type is imported herbal cannabis. And you can see from these two that cannabis dealers in South London are quite generous. You get a free ballpoint pen with your cannabis. No, that's just to show you the size. Can we click on? And this is sinsemilla, or colloquially known as skunk, although skunk has now got a bad name. So in London, people don't say they're smoking skunk. They're smoking the same stuff, but it's often called Cali for California instead. Can we click on? So this is this on the left is a suitcase full of cannabis that the police confiscated in London from cannabis users, and Marta had to take this suitcase full of predominantly skunk through the underground, and she was convinced that the smell of skunk is quite strong. She was convinced that everybody in the underground could smell the cannabis. But anyway, she made it to the lab with it, and so we tested it there. So you can see me looking a bit cheery. So maybe there's passive inhalation of cannabis, and there's a picture of the cannabis. So what we found was that there was no skunk had not changed. It was still about 15% as it was back in 2000, but it had just taken over the market. So 94% of the cannabis in London is skunk. But now, of course, you can get more potent forms of cannabis. So you can, for in Holland, you can get cannabis oil, or 40%. In Colorado, you can get crumble or honeycomb or shatter or butter, and they go up to 90% THC. So it's a bit like when people discovered that instead of having to drink watery beer, you could distill it and you could get whiskey. So I used to say that skunk was the whiskey of cannabis. But now when we talk to people in Colorado and our psychiatrists in Colorado and California, and we say skunk is high potency, they laugh. And they say, if only our people were smoking what you call skunk, that would be low potency. Can we click on? So of course, cannabis also has some medicinal uses, and there are some studies where there's actually been a randomized controlled trials. So in chronic pain, cannabis has a modest effect. I mean, it's not a powerful analgesic. It's a bit like a couple of paracetamol. But in addition to that, of course, you get a slight lift. So you get a little bit euphoria, which is probably quite a good thing if you've got chronic pain. Then you can get it's very good for nausea. So in our oncology department, if people have the chemotherapy and are very nauseous, they can have they can have a cannabis, or there is a synthetic a THC, which is called nabalone. An unfortunate thing that's happening in the States is that ladies are being given a cannabis where it's legal for early morning sickness during pregnancy. Quite an effective use of Sativex, which is a combined THC and CBD, is for the spasticity of multiple sclerosis. So that's a drug that you can prescribe, and is modestly useful in decreasing a spasticity in people with multiple sclerosis. But the big effect, the beneficial effect of CBD in particularly is in childhood epilepsy. Remember these poor little children you might have seen on television over the last couple of years who are having maybe 100 or 200 fits in a day and are resistant to all forms of anticonvulsants. Well, CBD can be spectacularly successful in diminishing these, or in some cases abolishing these fits. So there's no doubt that this is the one area where it is really spectacularly effective. So there are these are the studies where there is good randomized control evidence, and the drugs have got past the FDA or the equivalent in the UK and Europe. Can we have another click? If you go on the internet, you'll see cannabis being advocated for absolutely everything without any randomized controlled trial evidence. For example, people who are addicted to opiates in the States, they suggested, well, maybe if you took marijuana, you could switch from opiates to marijuana. But in fact, what happens is you end up addicted to both. And there's also lots of websites where you're advised to take a cannabis for depression or anxiety or PTSD or insomnia. And cannabis doctors, or what they call pot docs in the States, they believe, I think, that cannabis can help these conditions. There is no randomized evidence. And what is difficult to, it's a bit like alcohol. If you say to an alcoholic, what do you do when you feel absolutely terrible in the morning? You take alcohol to abolish the withdrawal effects. So it may be that some people, when they've been taking cannabis, they get depressed or anxious, or they certainly they can't sleep. When they stop taking the cannabis, they can't sleep and they get depressed and anxious. Therefore, they take the cannabis to abolish the withdrawal effect. So it's sometimes difficult to know the difference. Sorry, that's our dog Iona contributing. When COVID started, I said to Marta, I'm sure in no time at all somebody will be advocating cannabis for COVID, and of course that has happened. No evidence, of course. Can we go on to the next one? So CBD is claimed to be beneficial for everything from cancer to COVID, and you can see adverts for CBD if you go down any high street. Of course, it's mostly water. It's homeopathic doses of CBD. CBD is quite expensive because you have to get the plant produces THC and CBD together, and then you have to get rid of the THC, which is quite difficult. Click again. So there has been a systematic review of cannabinoids in the treatment of psychiatric disorders. Click again. And there was no evidence that cannabinoids are beneficial. But as I said, this is not what the experience of patients and USA pot docs. But the question is it a placebo effect? Or is it treating the withdrawal symptoms? Or is it maybe some of the effect of the CBD along with the THC? So that's not really been resolved yet. On we go. Also, Phil Maguire and Paul Morrison, well, mostly the work of Paul Morrison, published a paper that showed if you give massive doses of CBD on top of antipsychotics, this produces a modest improvement in people with chronic schizophrenia. So these are huge doses. And there's another positive study, but there also are a couple of negative studies. So it's really not clear whether CBD is helpful or not to people with psychosis. On we go to the next one. It used to be said that cannabis doesn't cause dependence, but it does. You get loss of control, you get craving, you get tolerance, and you get withdrawal. The withdrawal symptoms don't come on immediately because cannabis hangs around in the body for up to a month. So you don't really get any withdrawal symptoms much for about 3 or 4 days. One of the things, as cannabis has become more potent, it's much easier to get dependent. It used to be said that 10% of daily users are dependent. Now they say about 30%. Can we go on? So this is showing you what happened in Holland. So the red line, the red line is the potency of cannabis. And you can see that in the early 2000s, it went up from about 9% to 20%. And then it came down a bit, back down to about 15% on average. And you can see that a few years later, the green line, more people were coming for treatment for cannabis-related problems. And that reached a peak a few years after the peak of potency in THC. And then it began to come down as well. So the liability to dependence and to problems is related to the potency. On we go to the next one. So other risks of heavy use, you get cognitive impairment, what's sometimes called, you become a stoner. So most young people know, some smart person that was in their class at school who got hooked on cannabis and 10 or 15 years later sits about doing nothing except smoking all day, and seems to have lost some of their faculties. But it's still not proven. While you're intoxicated, you're certainly cognitively impaired. whether you're cognitively impaired once you stop is hotly disputed. Click again. And again, there we go. So increased risk of violence. If you look at the homicides by schizophrenic patients in England, 94% of the people with the diagnosis of schizophrenia were taking either alcohol or a drug. So only 6% of people with schizophrenia who carried out homicide were not using either alcohol or drugs. So half of them were using alcohol and half of them were using cannabis. So, you know, we tend to think of cannabis of the great days of the hippies, and they make love, not war, and peace, and so on from pop festivals. Heavy cannabis use makes you paranoid. When you're paranoid, you may feel you're being attacked, and therefore you may respond. On we go. Next one. So click again. 3 meta-analyses have shown that cannabis use is a risk factor for psychotic disorder. Click again. So each of these lines is a study. And on the left-hand side of the figure are the 20% of people who have either not used cannabis at all or used the least cannabis. And on the right-hand side are the people who've used the most cannabis. And up the vertical axis is the odds ratio for developing psychosis. And all you can see in all of these studies that the people who are using more cannabis, or the 20% who are using most cannabis, have a greater odds ratio of psychosis than the people who are not. But you can see there's a big variability. Down at the bottom is that the black line is Tien study, and that's from the USA in 1990. And the reason why there isn't much effect is because cannabis was quite sort of wimpish in these days, and it was not potent at all, and therefore the effect was quite small. But if you look at the red line, that's London in 2012, you can see that the odds ratio is now over 7. So the more potent the cannabis, the more risk of psychosis. Though one has to say, if we say roughly that 1% of the population will develop schizophrenia-like psychosis, if the odds ratio is 7, so if it's then 7, you're 7 times more likely. That means that 7% will develop a psychosis. So it still means that most people who use cannabis heavily will not develop psychosis. It's a bit like alcohol, that you know, that the more alcohol you drink, the more you risk becoming dependent or liver failure and so on. But everybody knows people who've been massive drinkers who seem to get by without a lot of without the expected problems. This picture is the chap who did it, whose name was Vangelis Vassos, who's from Greece, and you might think that he's swimming about in the Mediterranean, but he's actually swimming about off Skye, I think it is. Yes, he went his holidays to Skye. On we go to the next slide. So now I think it's now generally accepted that cannabis use is a component cause of psychosis of schizophrenia. So there's genetic predisposition, there's obstetric events, there's being brought up in an inner city, there's adverse life events, and there's drug use. All of these things are risk factors for psychosis. But is it big enough, the effect big enough to have any effect on the incidence of psychosis? Click again. So this is a big study that we did across Europe, this was analysed by this lady, Jongsma, and it came out in 2018. If you're thinking of going your holidays and you think, oh, I see psychotic people every day, I'd like to go somewhere where I won't meet a lot of psychotic people in the street, well, don't come to South London, because the incidence of psychosis in South London is 61 per 100,000. We got everybody from a catchment area in each of these centres and use the same trained everybody to use the same diagnostic criteria and so on. So this is as tight in terms of diagnosis and epidemiology as you can get. So London had the most, then Amsterdam and Paris. And you all know the epidemiology. It says that in smaller towns the incidence is lower. So in Cambridgeshire the incidence of psychosis was much lower than in London. In Leiden in Holland it was much lower than in Amsterdam, and in France in Clermont-Ferrand, which is a rural area, it was much lower than in Paris. But this didn't hold for Southern Europe. In Southern Europe, places like Madrid and Barcelona had much lower rates. Or if you think of Italy, here's Bologna, Verona, they're sort of small towns in North Italy, and Palermo, which is a big city, is say bigger than Glasgow, in Sicily. So the incidence in Palermo, and I think they pretty well got everybody, is say a fifth of what it is in London. Marta always says this, that she took a big risk in moving from Palermo to London. Her chances of going psychotic increased 5 times, but she's okay so far, I have to say. Can we go on to the next one? So what's the reason? What is the reason for this difference? And of course, we looked at cannabis, and you can see that this is looking in London and in Amsterdam. The risk is usual up the vertical axis is the odds ratio for psychosis, and on the left hand side are people who don't smoke much cannabis, or never or rarely, or they smoke relatively weak old-fashioned cannabis, less than 10% THC. And the orange are people who took daily old-fashioned cannabis, so daily less than 10% cannabis. Their odds ratio, I think, I can't quite see it very well, it's about double. But here are in green are the people who took a daily high potency cannabis. You can see they're 5 times more likely to develop psychosis in this study. And it's much the same in Amsterdam, except a bit higher. And here you can see our late beloved Queen. And as you know, she used to get lots of presents. And here somebody has given her some cannabis. But she was a smart old lady, and she knew that whereas the old-fashioned 1960s cannabis didn't do people much harm, that smelly skunk stuff could make a big problem, and therefore she passed it by. I don't know whether it's a real. I think it's a spoof, that picture. Marta is saying it's a real picture, but I don't remember the Queen on the news distinguishing between types of cannabis. Anyway, so we looked, and in particular Marta looked at the relationship between the frequency of cannabis use and the incidence of psychosis. So this is the same sort of incidence, but it's in red, and you can see it's highest in London, Amsterdam, and Paris. And this is daily cannabis use, and you can see that the one tracks the other. There's quite a high correlation. The places with a lot of cannabis use have a high incidence of psychosis. The places with low cannabis use have a low incidence of psychosis. On we go. Sorry, so the next question is, yeah, that's just as, can you go back again? Yeah, that's fine. This is to say that we calculated the population attributable fraction. That is the proportion of first episode psychosis which would be abolished if nobody smoked a cannabis and or high potency cannabis, and it was 32% in London and 50% in Amsterdam. So if we could get rid of a third of our, new presentations with psychosis, yeah, I don't know how closely you follow the psychiatric services in England, but they are a mess, particularly in big cities. We're overwhelmed with people with psychosis, and if we could get rid of a third of them, if people didn't smoke so much high potency cannabis, that would be a great benefit to our services. On we go, next one. So that's we have evidence from another study in the developing world that the places where there's high cannabis use have a higher incidence than places that don't use cannabis. But what about taking one country and see what happens when cannabis use changes. On we go, next one. So this is Denmark, and click again. This is a chap called Karsten Horstorp. I can't pronounce that very well. This is the incidence of schizophrenia since back in the 60s. You can see that seemed to decrease, actually, if anything, for a little while, and then it increased from the 1990s onwards. And during this period, the consumption of cannabis and its potency increased. So they looked to see what about the association between cannabis dependence and schizophrenia. Click again. So this is the proportion of schizophrenia, the population attributable fraction to cannabis dependence, actually. So this, which went from 2% in 1972 to 8% in 2016. So this is dependence. And people who had actually got a diagnosis of dependence. So probably there's lots of other cannabis users who are in these figures that we don't know about. What about more locally? Can I have the next one? This is South London, and this is schizophrenia, not psychosis. This is work by particularly by Diego Quattroni, and in the 60s, the incidence of schizophrenia was running about 11, 14, 80, and then in the 80s it went up to 18%, the 90s, 20s. By 2012, it was up to 35 per 100,000, and it stayed about that subsequently. And the orange is the proportion of people who were noted to be heavy users of cannabis. So again, it's an association. You can't prove it, but they're both going in the same direction. Next one. So this is just the USA, where you can either have medicinal cannabis or recreational cannabis. Click again. If you're driving to Colorado, there's a lot of cannabis tourism, and you can see on the highway weed is legal in 60 miles. Then the next one says, the big poster says, "Who is Jesus?" But if you don't know, and you're more interested, you can find a map on your app. There's an app to tell you where the nearest cannabis store is. So everywhere that cannabis has been legalized, cannabis use has increased, cannabis potency has increased, and cannabis use disorder has increased in the states which have legalized. On we go. So these are just some adverts from California. So some of them are quite clever. So flower to the people, stoner. I always thought being a stoner was an insult, but you can buy cannabis which is called stoner. You can have cannabis delivered to your house. Well, actually, you can get cannabis delivered to your house in South London, whether it's legal or not. And then here's an advert saying, if you're going to use cannabis every day, this is a particularly good one to take. This is everyday cannabis. The cannabis companies are being bought up by the cigarette companies. Cigarette companies have a lot of empty factories, so they're looking for ways to use these, and one of these is to manufacture cannabis cigarettes. Next one. This is looking at the US states in green who have legalized for recreational use. The blue ones have legalized for medicinal use, and the grey ones at this time, they hadn't legalized at all. And on the right is a figure showing that the longer that cannabis has been legalized, then the greater the proportion of psychosis that is due to cannabis. So these studies are just beginning to come out of the USA. It's difficult to do epidemiology in the US because they don't really have a health system. They have all sorts of different individual hospitals, and it's difficult to calculate how many psychotics there are in an area. Next one. So this is me finishing. heavy cannabis use has a significant impact on the incidence of psychosis. Countries where cannabis use is high have a higher incidence than places where cannabis use is low. It would be interesting to know how what the incidence is in Scotland. I have the impression that that cannabis use is still not quite as high as it is in South London, but also in country, and as cannabis use changes in a country, you get more psychosis. There may be all sorts of other benefits of legalizing cannabis, but in terms of psychosis, we really need public campaigns to advise people of the risks of daily use of high potency cannabis. And as you'll hear from Marta, we need specialized treatment centers for people with cannabis-induced psychosis. So I will stop at that point, and apologies for all the kerfuffle at the beginning with the echo and the not being able to show to click on the slides.
Thanks a lot for that, Robin. That was really comprehensive and some very interesting stuff about the increase in incidence. I think that's probably one of the major questions that people were asking all the time. If the potency of cannabis was increasing, why do we not see an increase in the incidence of psychotic illness like schizophrenia? But you've clearly shown that it is actually increasing in several of the cities, basically, where these are available. We have a couple of questions. Would it be okay if we just
Sure.
Yeah. So, would you say that CBD being bred out of most modern strains is related to higher cases of schizophrenia? That's the first question.
Well, we believe, if you'd asked me that 10 years ago, I would have said yes, because we did these studies where, Paul Morrison particularly, where he could abort the effects of the psychotogenic effects of THC by giving a big dose, a huge dose of CBD before, and that was but that was a huge dose. So we then thought, is there enough CBD in an old-fashioned joint to have any effect on aborting the effect of the THC in it? And the answer is no.
Right.
That you would have to have about 10 times as much CBD in a joint actually to have an effect. So although we thought that getting rid of the CBD and increasing the THC was a sort of double whammy, in fact, it turns out it's really down to the concentration of the THC.
Yeah.
In medicinal cannabis in the UK is reasonably strict. So
right.
You actually do have to see a specialist, a consultant, and you have to in the NHS it is quite, you have to have a proper indication like MS or epilepsy or something like that. The private clinics are getting around that a bit, but it's not like in the US, places where there is medicinal cannabis. You go and you see a pot doc, and he asks you maybe one question: does marijuana make you feel better? And if you say yes, then you get medicinal cannabis, and he gets $100.
And actually, Rajiv, in terms, for instance, of the clinic that Robin mentioned, although I guess they are less strict than the NHS would be, they have some rules. So, for instance, one of the young people under my care as a consultant psychiatrist is actually getting some cannabis from this clinic. And one of the conditions of him being accepted was that he had to be under the care of a mental health team. So I could pick up the pieces, but at least gives a little bit of, if you like, framework and protection to the person.
Okay. I'll just go for one more question specifically to one of the slides that Robin had presented. So in reference to the patients with schizophrenia, would the 47% of people who were using cannabis also be using alcohol? This is in regards to the violence slide, I think. So would the 47% of people who were using cannabis also be using alcohol and any other drugs? And the other half were only using alcohol. Yeah.
Some of them would be, and that, of course, that has. I mean, that was it. there was a big issue in relation to psychosis for a long time, where the cannabis users also using amphetamine and cocaine, and it took us a while to do studies to eliminate the effect of these other drugs. What I'm showing you is just data, routine collected data. So some of these people are, I mean, a proportion of these people are using both alcohol and cannabis, but we're doing a meta-analysis at present, and I think there is no doubt that cannabis has an effect on increasing risk of violence. I mean, you have to batter at it. There is a nice book by a man called Alex Berenson on marijuana, something like What to Tell Your Children, and he was a journalist for the New York Times who was married to a forensic psychiatrist, and he tells the story in the introduction that he said to his wife, "How were things today?" And she said, "Oh, just the usual thing. A couple of cannabis users, or marijuana users, they call them, users." So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence, but now there are there is quite good evidence that cannabis, heavy cannabis use, makes you more paranoid, and therefore you act on your paranoia. So it's not like alcohol, that on a Saturday night you're having a good time and you're disinhibited and you're up for a fight. It's more that you're paranoid, and therefore you're out to get them before they get you.
And Rashid, if I can, from a clinical point of view, one of the consultant psychiatrists who also has done research in cannabis and psychosis, he runs one of the PQ in our trust in London. And with one of his trainees, has actually looked at data in relation to people coming to his unit that, by definition, if you end in a PQ with psychosis, usually there is a high level of aggression, and he has measured the level of aggression and violent behavior and the cannabis consumption taken into account, so excluding other drugs. Mm-hmm. And he has found that in 70% of the people that come to his unit, cannabis is the solo drug which is associated at the time of the admission.
Right. So that was very clear. I think there are a few more questions, especially, but
we could do that.
I was just wondering, we could do at the end. Yeah. So we'll do that in the end. Marta, can I leave the stage to you then for your
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I was wondering if we can try once again if I can have control, because I'm not as famous as Robin, so I usually control my own slide, and I hate having to say next, because I've got lots of animation.
Yeah, I've given you control, so do you want to give it a go?
You can't do it either.
Oh dear, can't. Oh yes. Hold on. It seems that it's working. Anyway, so nice to be with all of you. As Robin said, I would have loved to be in Glasgow, but it's nice to know that you are connecting throughout Scotland, which after my own country, Italy, is my favorite place in the world. So Robin has talked to you primarily about the role that cannabis might play in the onset of psychosis in the first place. As a clinician and somebody interested in cannabis and psychosis, for many years, I have come across many young people who had developed psychosis, and some of them in the context of cannabis use, who then continue to use cannabis or even started using cannabis after the onset of psychosis. And this is the group I will be talking about today. And so firstly, I'm just going to briefly touch, rather than on my experience, on the research evidence on the effects that cannabis has on psychosis. And this is important because, especially now in the medicinal cannabis culture, and there is some suggestion, especially if you look at social media rather than evidence, that cannabis can relieve some of the distress associated with psychotic symptoms. And again, when I talk to my patient about this, well, they'll say that if they use cannabis while they are intoxicated, the intensity of the voice is less, the anxiety and the distress is less, That's because of some of the direct acute effect of the high. But then what happens is that when the intoxication fades, there is actually increasing in intensity and frequency of the psychotic symptoms. And so this becomes a sort of vicious circle. Now, what are the evidence telling us? I don't think this is working, so I have to give in, thank you very much, is that indeed there have been now at least 4 meta-analyses, and this is one of the largest, which suggests that if you continue to use cannabis following the onset of psychosis, you are much more likely, can we go next please, to suffer from relapse, to be readmitted to hospital, and can we go next, and to also have more severe symptoms. And in particular, this group of young adults have a psychosis which is predominantly characterized by paranoid delusion. There can be auditory hallucination which are consistent with the paranoid delusion, but the core of the psychosis is really sort of this sense of being constantly under threat. And most of the young people I see, they become more and more withdrawal, and they tend to be confined to their own flat, which at some point also becomes an unsafe environment, because some of them believe that, for instance, the television is broadcasting their thoughts or referring to their life, or even that there is a microchip under their floorboard. So what it was familiar and safe to them becomes increasingly more sort of threatening. And next, please. And this is the work of Tabia, a scholar who followed up a cohort of first episode psychosis patients who had been attending the trust where Robin and I both work in London, which is the South London and mostly NHS Trust. And what she showed is that when you follow up this first episode at 2 years and you ask them about the frequency and the type of cannabis they have used after the psychosis onset, and you plot in a graph like this, the one that have stopped using cannabis after the psychosis onset and the one who have continued to use with a variety of pattern of use, you can see that here on top you have in green the one who have continued to use and they've used daily and they've used skunk type cannabis. And these are the one, this is a survival plot, which at each given time compared to everybody else are much more likely to suffer a relapse of the psychosis. And next, please. And next as well. And when Tabia quantifies this in odds ratio, so in the amount of the increased probability of these events, overall there is a 3 times increased risk of relapse, fewer months between one relapse and the other, which means less time being well and be able to recuperate a sort of good quality of life, and also increased risk of being admitted to an intensive psychiatric care unit that we all know is not the best place to be admitted to. Next, please. And next, please. So in the context of all of this, I've also been quite concerned about where we are going next. And you are actually lucky not to be in London, because our mayor, he's very keen on the California model. And this is him having visited California last year. And I always say, look stoned, even if without having tried cannabis, just by being in this extraordinary Californian cannabis plantation. And because of that, he has decided that he's planning to pilot a cannabis sort of legalization project in a borough of London, which happens to be in our trust. So I'm not necessarily very impressed by that. And then you can see that cannabis has already, or is about to make it in space. Elon Musk is planning to plant cannabis in space, as you know, is a very enthusiastic cannabis user. So cannabis is going everywhere and taking more space, even in the marketing or at the societal level. Next, please. And this is a classic email that I received from colleagues. No, please back. At least once a week. And actually this morning, while Robin was speaking, I received an email from a parent of a young man who lives in Sweden, who is telling me about his son having been doing very well at university, absolutely brilliant, increasing his cannabis use and having developed psychosis, stopped cannabis use, goes back to uni, starts cannabis again, and is admitted to hospital again. And this is from a colleague that works in my trust. So I began to say, well, I'm a clinician, not just an academic. It's not necessarily enough that I share what I know from research. Maybe I could use this research together with my colleagues to begin to do something for this group of young adults that, at least in UK, were traditionally falling into a gap between first episode psychosis service. I should say I'm an early intervention consultant, and addiction. Early intervention team are very good with psychosis, but they're not necessarily competent to address addiction issue. And addiction services were very well equipped to work with people with dependence, but were struggling with the complexity that someone with psychosis would bring along. Next, please. So I'm very fond of Walt Disney, I've always been. Robin teases me and says that I still have the brain of a child because I spend most of my free time watching movies for children, including re-watching all the Walt Disney classic. And one of the things I like about Walt Disney is what he says in this slide, which is, if you can dream of it, you can do it. And this is what I thought about. I always dreamt, since I started working with this group of young people, that we could have at some point a service for them where they could also contribute to shape the service and be part of the intervention we deliver. So I started with dreaming it, and now we are beginning to make it real and consolidate it. Next slide, please. So this is part of the dream becoming true, and one of the main hazards was funding, as always it is in the NHS. And so, of course, there was no point of asking my trust for money. And we have a charity, the Mostly charity, that is actually located in our trust. And so I applied together with the extraordinary team of experts that you'll see on the right side here of the slide. So I put together any experts I could get hold of, most of whom were friends, so they were very happy to say yes from the start, who knew anything about addiction and had a reputation in the field. The lady, actually Professor Anne McNeil, who had created and launched and established our smoking cessation program, with also the psychosis experts like Robin and others. Our head of pharmacy was the one that writes, by the way, the Mosley guidelines, and lots of the wonderful nursing staff who was already working very much in the shadow with these patients, which represented the dual diagnosis pathway. And so in some way it was very difficult to say no to our request of funding, because we were bringing all the possible expertise you can think of, and we were really asking to target a group who was neglected, who brought together lots of young people from ethnic minority, as you'll see in a moment, and deprived areas. So this was also an area that interested charity to support. And this was my initial team, which we didn't have funding to pay salary. We psychiatrists are quite expensive. And so I started, I don't get paid for this work. And these are my PhD students. And this is Diego I mentioned, who works in the PQ. So the initial sort of group of clinicians was for free. We needed resources for a nurse who could lead the initial work. And then also for what you'll see, we use as some of the tools. Next, please. So we, first of all, wanted to be identified with a logo, and thanks to the inspiring creativity of our patients who were part of the project from the beginning, we created this logo, which represents what they wanted to be their journey, from a brain full of cannabis to a brain that leaves more space to exercise, to reading, education, music. And one of them in particular, who is very close to my heart, said, well, can you promise Dr. Di Forti a girlfriend? Well, I can't promise girlfriend, but sadly, one of the things that's happened to all of them who have come through is that they go back into that social network of friends. Next, please. And so with our first initial funding, we were able to put together what is the one-to-one intervention, which is offered to this group of young people who once a week for up to an hour, depending how much they can tolerate because of the background psychosis, they meet with a therapist, and we'll say in a moment who these therapists are, and they use tools which are very familiar in addiction, and they do a journey that can have a can vary in length depending from the individual needs. And also we decided that we wanted to put together all the information that we are developing in this experience into an online e-learning platform, which could be accessed to anybody at any time in point, in terms of both our patients group, but also family and staff who is working or is involved in the care of this population. And this is something that we did a pre-launch last year, and now following the feedback, we are sort of repolishing it. And the idea is that when this is actually done, could be shared also with other colleagues like yourself across the UK, if others find it helpful. And thanks to some more funding so I keep asking money to this charity, but they haven't got bored with me yet. And we got some more funding recently. Next, please. And Diego, with very IT skills, is actually leading on the further developing of the online platform. But I would say the jewel of the clinic is what's coming in the next slide. Next, please. And next as well is the peer group. So this is something that any of you can do. All you need is somebody who can set up an online Zoom, which runs perhaps once a week. Initially, we started once every 2 weeks because we needed to get a bit more organized. So our peer group, and you're very welcome to join if you like, just drop me an email, is a space where we decided to use a model which is very familiar in addiction, which is the one of the peer support, but also bearing in mind that this is a population that also has an ongoing psychosis, and also a population where previous evidence have shown that psychoeducation does work. And so the peer group normally begins with a song, which is chosen by our guest speaker. And we have been having, because it's on Zoom, guest speakers from all around the world. We had actually Paul Morrison from Scotland. We had people from the Netherlands, from California, from Canada, from round the corner, and so on and so forth, who will talk about a topic that has to do with cannabis. You can see in this example leaflet is actually about using cannabis and tobacco together. They tend to keep it to 10-15 minutes because that's the purpose of spark the conversation among the peers. And the peers are people who are under the care of our trust and beyond, who have psychosis and cannabis use, and they are at different stages of their journey. Some of them would have stopped and they will share their experience. Some of them are still using and very keen on cannabis, and they actually coming because they're not convinced that cannabis is having any role in the psychosis and want to hear about what these people have to say. And to see how these different groups interact with each other, believe me, has been one of the most powerful learning experiences to me as a clinician and even as an academic, because it spark more question in my academic world. And the patients that join are actually some in the community and some also in the inpatient wards across our trust. So again, different level as well of severity in terms of the psychosis. And they can have the video on if they wish to, but also they can have the video off like you have it today and just use the chat to contribute if they don't feel comfortable to speak up. So they are protected in terms of some of the anxiety they might have with being in a group. And this has been a very successful experience. We have we did it this Tuesday and we after the Christmas break, and we had 35 people joining in, and some of these joining in was multiple because it included 4 or 5 people from different inpatients units. And for this, you just need somebody like me who's willing to bother people around the world to come and give a talk, and some of your students with IT skills that can actually set up the meeting and create a sort of appealing leaflet. Next, please. And next one, please. And we can do next up to the end of this slide, so it's probably easier. Thank you. And there is another next, and another next. Fine, thank you. And so this is the model of our one-to-one intervention. So as you can see in yellow on this block, we use things like motivational interviewing, SMART goal setting, role play, harm reduction, imagery. These are all tools that I'm not expecting necessarily all of you to be familiar. I wasn't at the beginning of all of this because I'm not an addiction expert. I've learned all along, which are very successful in addiction. And the contingency management is the use of voucher, which addiction has been piloting, at least in psychiatry, more than other branches. But there are some clinics in the wards that, for instance, reward patients for coming to the depot with a voucher. And what we're doing differently about the vouchers is that, of course, they are used as an immediate reward. So when people attend a session and they achieve the goal that they've set for themselves, by the way, they're not told what to do, they get a voucher. But the voucher is not a voucher I choose. I always say, as long as it's legal and is within the budget that each patient has allocated, and I can send it online, they can choose it. And so we had some young people who used the vouchers to buy themselves books, some that they saved them to buy themselves a computer to start studying again. A lady wanted to do a nail vanishing course, and we saved the funding, and then I paid online for the course and she completed the course. So often it is part of thinking for them what is something that for them represents a motivation to stop using cannabis, or a tool that they can use to replace the role that cannabis has played to them up to that point. And of course, we try to measure outcome. So we do what we call a core assessment at the beginning, and my colleagues who are PhD students, but also psychiatrists, have taken care of that. And we have selected a number of clinical interviews rather than research interview that allow us at the beginning of the journey to have a baseline where people are, and you'll understand more about what we're using in a moment, but also to empower the people to know where they are at the beginning of the journey in terms of score. Each interview we have specifically selected gives you a score, and how these numbers change over time. And we do this assessment at the beginning, midpoint, at the end. We collaborate with local resources, including Marijuana Anonymous, which I would say, if you haven't been in collaboration with, look at their website. They're absolutely a wonderful organization. And of course, we have tried to look how this can have an impact by measuring outcome. You see prescribed Sativex to a selected group, and you'll see a little bit more in a moment. Next, please. So because we work in collaboration with the referring team, the referral process is very simple. Any team in our trust can refer somebody with psychosis and cannabis use. I just need an email with the patient details. And one of the things I do in collaboration with the referring team is talk to the clinician about medication review. Next, please. And we talk about the mainstream, for instance, antipsychotic that the patient is taking. Next, please. And we consider, if appropriate, to support the patient together or alongside, if you like, the psychological intervention with accessing Sativex. So Robin mentioned Sativex. Sativex is made from cannabis. We have seen with Robin the plants that you extract the THC and the CBD from, and it has a 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD with a THC which is pretty low. There is a trial which was published in JAMA in 2019 that shows that for people with cannabis use disorder, so forget about psychosis for a moment, if you add Sativex to psychological intervention, you increase the effectiveness and improve the chances of people to stop using cannabis and maintaining their goal. So I got permission by our wonderful head of pharmacy off license to prescribe to patients with psychosis Sativex. If you read the leaflet, it says contraindication, people with psychosis. But again, these were young people who were using such an amount of cannabis that a little bit of THC from Sativex was very unlikely to have an impact. And next slide. We have at least now 6 people that have used Sativex, and I have an example in a moment. But also it was important for us to look at the revision or of the actual mainstream psychotic treatment. And sorry, next one. And the reason is that lots of studies who have used PET have actually shown, I mean, you will know that one of the characteristics of psychosis is having an increase in dopamine release. This has been well established and replicated. But when you look at the brain of drug abusers, this can be cannabis, can be amphetamine, can be tobacco, actually, dependence. We find that there is something different in their dopamine system, even if they have psychosis, which is they have a decrease in D2 receptor and a decrease in dopamine release. Next one, please. And what is interesting is that this deficit of dopamine activity rather than enhanced dopamine activity are actually in area of the brain that also have an important role in loss of control and compulsive behavior, like drug intake. Next, please. And it is therefore important when we think about a treatment for these people that we know what we're actually doing to the dopamine system, even if they are psychotic when we're treating them. And we also know that, for instance, because of this deficit of dopamine system in this area of the brain, they're less likely to respond to reward. So when we engage them in reward, we also need to be aware that the dopamine system might not respond so enthusiastically when they receive a reward. So those tools might not be as effective as in other groups. So one of this is a wonderful, which I recommend, review by the queen of drug addiction, which is Professor Nora Volkov, who says that when we think about therapeutic intervention in people with dual diagnosis, psychosis and substance misuse, including cannabis, we should aim at restoring the brain dopamine tone in this cortical projection rather than dampening even further. Next one, please. And in fact, there beginning to be some evidence of how the use of partial agonist might be the best antipsychotic of choice in this population. And there's some suggestion, I don't know how much access you have to cariprazine in Scotland, we can talk about it, but perhaps cariprazine has an additional advantage, which is the one of being a partial agonist at the D3 receptor, and D3 receptor have an important role in craving. Next one. So this is the example of one of my patients. This is a gentleman who is slightly older than my average patients in the cannabis clinic. He has used cannabis for 25 years. In fact, he's pretty much my age. I think we're just a few months apart. And he has been using 1 gram of Kali, this that Robin referred to, which has got up to 20% THC and neglectable CBD. And he has repeated hospital admission. In fact, he had 13 hospital admissions throughout his life, and only 2 of them were not under the Mental Health Act. Currently, he is on a depot, and he was referred to me, next please, because during his latest hospital admission, as part of a project I have with my inpatient consultant colleagues, we prescribed to him Sativex. Next one, please. And he was doing quite well on Sativex. He came out of hospital and within week 1, as usually happens, bounced back to have 7 joints a day. So he came to me, and with the great support of his mum, who was very worried, as you can imagine, about him, we agreed on a plan of him using his Sativex in the community throughout the day, trying to keep his first part of the day off street cannabis and only limiting the use to the evening. Thanks to this, he already managed to drop from week 1 to week 2 to only using 3 joints in the evening. And now we are on 2.5 joints. And the plan is that 2 days a week, he would try either not to have any cannabis in the evening or at least have 1, which he has been successful, and he's getting his vouchers. His life has been transformed. He's actually driving a car. He's a snooker former champion. He's going back to his snooker club. His mum has mentioned that she has his son back. And this is a gentleman that often we give up, because by age 50, if you've been in hospital 13 times, you think that's going to be what his future lies for him. But actually, it's been amazing for me to see how, despite he still has quite a fair amount of THC in his system, and of course he's on a depot medication, which, by the way, along these 4 weeks has gone from 500 milligrams to 300. So even his consultant has been able to reduce his depot with less, as you can imagine, side effect. Next, please. And next, please. Actually, we can skip this one all together, because we'll next. Thank you. So, of course, we work closely with the community mental health team, or EI intervention they're referring, because as soon as these people begin the journey of reducing their cannabis use, they need to have something to do. So we work with the occupational therapist and with a vocational trainer. And this is particularly important because now there are evidence, next please, that, for instance, suggests that something, next one, as easy to access as exercise can have a profound, yes, no, next one is fine, impact on craving. This is a very simple study which was published and on PLOS ONE, and you can ask me for the full reference if you can't access it, which shows how profound was the effect of doing exercise on reducing cannabis consumption, and next also craving. So you can see that how the cannabis consumption in slide on your left and on your right, the craving was at a baseline. So before people starting exercising, here all the different components in white are craving. And now after a week of exercise, all the components of craving reduced during the time when exercise was happening. There is a bit of a bounce back when people stop exercising, but the good news is that we all know that exercising is something we should have in our routine, not just do it for a couple of weeks and stop. And so involving young people in exercise, and I know it's difficult with people with psychosis, can also have an influence on their craving for cannabis, not just on their overall well-being. Next, please. So now I don't know what happened to my slides, but I don't see the percentages either, but luckily I remember them. So now I'm going to share with you who the people that have, the first 30 people who have completed the journey with the cannabis clinic are and what their outcome has been. So here you will see the ethnic, actually no, the gender breakdown, and blue is male and pink female. So you can see that over 80% of them are actually male. As you're no surprise, we've got more male in the psychosis population anyway. And here you have in orange, the ethnic minority group, which actually in our catchment area represents mostly Black British. And here you have the white population. Next one, please. And this is a breakdown of what people are using. 80% are using skunk type cannabis, which is predominantly this day in the latest group would be Cali. 50% of them, though, are actually using even more potent type of cannabis, which are becoming increasingly available. And this is other types, which when you talk about London, rarely goes less than 10% THC. Next, please. They all mix it with tobacco, by the way, and this is why we work very closely with our smoking cessation colleagues to try and get them at least on using the nicotine on an e-cigarette or other nicotine replacement therapy, so that then we then focus on the cannabis alone in what concerns what they're using in their joint. Next, please. Actually, we can skip this one because you had my story about the cannabis and the suitcase to say that has not changed very much what you expect from the concentration of THC in skunk. Next one, please. And next. Yeah, but actually what is becoming very popular now is getting cannabis online. This was a little exercise I did myself. You can see it says Wimbledon, which is where we live. I put on Google on my phone, where do I get cannabis near me? And that's what I got. And you can see the names are quite appealing, especially for Italian. You can get one called Gelato. And next, please, what you can see is that sadly, the THC content of these fancy names cannabis is pretty much the same as skunk. In fact, they are skunk type breeds of cannabis sativa, just renamed for better marketing. Next, please. Yeah, and next, please. And why is that important? It's not just important, as Robin mentioned, for the impact on the psychosis, but because of how this has an impact on the dependence and therefore the difficulties of these young people to come off it or reduce it if that's what they wish. This is a slide from the Netherlands, and in red you see how over time that potency of cannabis has gone up and then stabilized on a high average, and how alongside that the number of people seeking treatment for cannabis dependence has actually gone up. Next, please. Next, please. So here we have some outcome, and this is how I'm going to conclude. So in blue you have the score of cannabis dependent. And these are some of the questionnaire we use in our assessment. So the QDIT is the measure for cannabis dependence and gives you a very nice score. And if you are above 8, you have cannabis dependent. And you can see how at baseline in blue, they were all far above 8. In orange, you have after intervention, and you can see that they're not down to 0, and you'll see why, but they're certainly below 8. And you can see that in terms of tobacco dependence and actually alcohol dependence, these people are doing quite well. They are actually below the threshold for the respective scale for dependence. Next one, please. And the good news is that at the end of the intervention, 80% had achieved full abstinence and only 6% had continued to use, but they're gone from daily use to once a week, which is represented by this little orange group. Next one, please. So money spent. This is a group of young people who is not financially independent. They're either on benefits or they're depending on their family. Nevertheless, at baseline, they were on average spending more than £70 a week on cannabis. And you can see at the end of the intervention, and these represent the 6 that didn't achieve full abstinence, but a significant reduction, have gone down to 20 on average. And you can see this more clearly here, where you have baseline every use. All of them were daily users. And at a follow-up or endpoint, if you like, we have these 20% who are using once a week, and the remaining who have achieved abstinence. Next one, please. This is a measure of level of functioning. As part of the questionnaire, we have the GAF, which is general level of functioning. And you can see in this graph how when the consumption measured by the QDIT goes down between baseline and follow-up, or end of intervention, I should say, the level of function measured by the GAF goes up. And here you have the bar chart telling you that you have a jump from baseline to a follow-up, where you have an improvement from moderate symptoms to absence, or only symptoms which are a response to stressful context. And when you look at the actual symptoms, is an improvement from functioning. You have an improvement from severe impairment to functioning. I don't know what this, or to full functioning or mild impairment. Next one, please. And next one. And here you have a sense of how this translates in real life social functioning. So at baseline, we had 24, the 24 who have achieved full abstinence were all socially inactive. And at end of treatment, only 2 of them have remained inactive, 6 have gone back to vocational trainer, 4 in education, and 12 of them are actually in paid employment. Next one, please. And here is psychotic symptoms. So this is a group for whom hallucination is important core symptoms, but not directly related to the cannabis consumption. We had a little reduction, next please, from baseline to endpoint in terms of the intensity of the score of this scale on hallucination. But what it was striking was the effect on delusion, which went really clinically relevantly down. Next one, please. So in terms of future, we're trying to follow up this group. We're still early days. We know a 1-year follow-up, the 65% have maintained full abstinence and 70% have been discharged to primary care. 3 patients have become peer of our peer group, so they're actually now working to support the others. Next one, please. And next, actually. And we now been granted full funding by our trust 3 years down the line. So the trust can be convinced that they need to give you money for something that you can show has having an impact on the population we care for. And we have lots of projects involving more and more of my other clinical colleagues, medical students. We're doing qualitative improvement project, and this also is making our trust even more willing in some way to support us. Next, please. And this is something we had lots of press attention, actually, and this is a nice article from the Sunday Times. And what I like to share with you is the quote from our patient who says, "Now with the clinic, I'm looking at a life in a whole different ways. My brain is starting to work again. I'm doing an apprenticeship and it has changed my life." And as a clinician, you can do this for one person. I think this makes our job worthwhile for the remaining, 364 days of the week. Next one, please. And of course, this will not be possible without the inspiring and practical engagement of the young people I work with and for, and my colleagues who initially, like Eduardo and Julia and Diego, have done this entirely voluntarily out of their interest and free time. Tommaso, who is a medical student, many of my clinical placement students, and all my pets who keep me sane during my normal working schedule. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot for that, Marta. That was very interesting. We have some questions, but I thought I'll start a question by myself. I mean, the CCP is a great clinical model, and the peer group particularly, I thought was really good, and the crosstalk between addiction services and psychosis services, where it's very difficult to kind of get that sorted out. I think you've done a fantastic job. A couple of questions. How many people have you prescribed Sativex? And
so far,
yeah, go on.
sorry.
Yeah.
And how did we go on? I guess you want to know.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So far, I have prescribed it to 8. So Sativex is actually unfortunately quite expensive. So you have to have some initial funding to be able to do that.
Right.
So two of the 8 actually didn't like it because they didn't like the taste of it. Which is funny because the other 6 said they liked the taste because they thought it tastes like cannabis, so they knew it was really from the plant. The other 6, M that you heard about is ongoing, so it's early days to see if this will be sustained. But the remaining 5, they've all achieved, actually, it's been very helpful for them in a harm reduction fashion to titrate down the street cannabis use by maintaining the Sativex throughout the day, and then once they had achieved abstinence, to withdraw gently the Sativex, as you might do in an old-fashioned alcohol detox. Yeah. So nothing new again. And this has been very much learning with them because we don't have protocol how to do this in this group. So it's been really much about reviewing and see how they were getting on, what they could tolerate, make it longer on a certain amount of Sativex if they needed to consolidate their achievement. But the data so far have been quite promising.
Any relapse in psychosis?
So we haven't had in this group, but probably because it's very early days. No, certainly no relapse in psychosis at all. And I have to convince, of course, my trust that this is safe. And now we are actually doing on an inpatient ward when people get admitted to reduce cannabis withdrawal. And we had to do a sort of almost a rough calculation on the basis of what we expect to be in the THC that we're using up to the time, the THC that was in the cannabis that we're using up to the time of admission, by how many joints or grams, and say to the trust, this is the amount of THC they're getting in the system. If I give them Sativex 8 puff a day, this is how much less it would be. There's also some CBD. So we try to do it as accurately as we can, but certainly no relapse of psychosis. If anything, report from the inpatient unit that people are calmer.
Okay. What I'll do is I have a lot more questions, but I'll go to the Q&A section. So I'll just go by the most liked ones. Just to say thank you. Great to have a presentation from an engaging and clearly expert speaker. What would your ideal public campaign on the risks of daily cannabis use focus on?
Ideally, campaign would be a video with lots of picture, made by young people representing the ethnic group of our society, talking to each other, maybe in a small interview format, saying, you know, is it sensible to start using cannabis when you're 16? Don't you get stoned the following day? Yes, actually, I find that I can't do very well at school. And so bringing together the science that we have learned into a young people model of being engaged, rather than something that has me or Robin or one of you, with all respect, and telling them what to do.
What about Stormzy?
Or having Stormzy making a fantastic rap music on it.
Right.
I mean, one of the things we I had to this is I have also a research project called the Cannabis and Me study, where I need to recruit people from the general public, and I have a wonderful PR group that is working with me, and they've made fantastic video made by students with animation, with cannabis leaf, the brain, the genes, all the things we know are relevant to know about this. This is the public education campaign we need to do. Anything else, people will look and say, oh, well, this is the usual patronizing approach of telling us what to do or not, or not to do.
Fantastic. So the next
question. So if you know Stormzy, please let me know, because I'm trying to get hold of him, by the way.
Right. Because he says that cannabis was bad.
Yeah, because I don't know if you do know, but Stormzy has been very open about this. He developed a psychotic episode in the context of cannabis use.
I didn't know that, but
there you go. So quote Stormzy to your patients. They'll be impressed.
I shall do that. So the next question is, you have linked liberalization of cannabis to increase in psychosis. Is there an argument for legalization linked to strict regulation? That's, I think that's directed to Robin. Yeah.
Yes, I think there is an argument, and the one country that has done that is Uruguay. It has a sort of Stalinist approach, and you get ration cards, and so you can only have so much approved cannabis in a month. I mean, it has to be said that they didn't have a big cannabis problem before, so we don't know. So, but in theory, it should be possible to do cannabis legal with restrictions and warnings. For example, Canada, when they legalized, they had a warning on the packet: do not use this with machinery, or do not take it when you're pregnant, or if you take too much, you might develop psychosis. After a year, they removed the bit about psychosis. I think the cannabis companies got to them. So the problem, of course, is once you legalize something, it then gets commercialized, and can you control? I mean, if I thought our MPs could introduce legal cannabis without commercialization, then I think that would be excellent. But they've made a bit of a pig's ear of alcohol and tobacco. So I think that unfortunately you can buy politicians, and I think that's my worry.
And I guess now marketing and is not something you can control within one country, because you might reduce the marketing in UK, but you go on the web and you get the marketing from US or other places. And actually Canada, as you know, has legalized cannabis with attempt of controlling the potency and the access in terms of age. Now they have done reasonably well with age, but in terms of the potency has failed, and there is high potency cannabis all over the place in Canada, and the black market, if anything, is still in the background. So I think my bet, if we legalize, or for anyone that legalizes, is the public education, and hope that that will work as it has worked for tobacco.
Yeah, education is the most important thing, because people don't know it's a drug.
Great. So that's
Sorry,
fantastic.
Rajiv.
Oh,
I'm going to have to come in. I think that's our time up.
There you go.
Which is a real shame, because I mean, gosh, every day is a school day, and this has certainly been one of those mornings. And I think we could have chatted. There's a lot more questions in the Q&A box, so we'll do our best to get them answered and sent out with the resources from the event. I just wanted to give a quick final few things to say here. Just you'll see on the slide there that there's, if you don't already follow us or you want to be added to our mailing list for future events, please just contact us on some of the contacts you see on the screen. There is going to be an evaluation popped into the side, so if you could feed back from this, that would be really helpful for us to know how we can improve these events going forward. We have our next webinar on the 22nd of February from 1:30 till 3 o'clock. The event link will be going out for that next week. We have Dr. Vidya Iyer, who's a psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University in Canada, and she will be speaking on the local and global insights into what matters for meeting the mental health needs of young people with psychosis. So hopefully we'll see you there too. And I just want to end by saying a massive big thank you to our speakers today, to Robin and Marta. That was really, really fantastic presentations from you both today. Thanks to Rajiv for facilitating. A big thank you to everybody who's attended today and taken the time out. And finally to the fantastic team we have in the background that's making all this happen well. So thank you so much, everybody. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.